Hi everyone. I'm going to start recording here another session about ecology and start the next group here, the next module here. So this is module 6, ecology, populations, communities, and ecosystem, and the final module for biodiversity for spring of 2023. So first of all, the first chapter, the first concept I want to talk about are ecological scales of biology. Okay, how do we study biology and look at the bigger picture, or what we call the ecological scales. So what are my objectives here today? To define ecology and ecological worldviews, discuss biological scales, explaining ecological studies, and examine the first and second laws of population biology. That last one will be a separate video, which I will get to on another day, or probably tomorrow. So what is ecology colloquially, etymologically, and scientifically? So if you were to ask yourselves, what is ecology? Most of you usually use the term or hear the term to just mean any environmental concept. But of course, that is just a colloquial term. And every time I say I am an ecologist as a profession, um, I've said that about 700 times in the past 3 days. And every time, everyone says, "Oh, it's a very important job. It's a job of the future." When in reality, what they think about is environmental type jobs, not the actual science of ecology. So etymologically, the two words that build the concept of ecology are ecos and logos, where ecos means home, and logos means not the study of, as you've probably learned in the past, but instead that it means the laws of. So in other words, it is the laws of our home. I guess I've already gone through this, but we'll slowly get through that again. So colloquially, it's environmental challenges, protecting our environment or conservation, just study of animals, plants, climate. All of those are things that we tend to attribute colloquially to the study of ecology. Now, the scientific definition, on the other hand, is a lot more firm. So there's a few ways for us to think about what ecology necessarily is. So if I go into, I think this is from the Oxford Dictionary, it says an investigation of the laws governing the interactions, important word here, let me bring the little laser pointer out, the interactions, okay, between organisms, so that is organism to organisms, their abundance, how many animals and plants and bacteria and other things exist, and their distributions, where we find them, and of course the interactions between the animals themselves and the plants to the non-living components of the natural world. So in other words, the different parts of the world, such as the earth, water, air, light, right, different gases, etc. Some other things that people tend to think about are the changes. So interactions are changes of material, changes of size, age, abundance, etc. And those are always rates. Okay? And rates, of course, are derivatives. It's something over something else, which essentially means the way we tend to study ecology is heavily focused on math and specifically calculus. So most of you come into biology and you complain that you have to take too much math. But the reality is, first of all, here in the United States in general, we study a lot less math as part of our biology curriculum than people do in other countries. But the foundations of all natural sciences really ends up being in calculus-based models. And that's why it's so important for you to have calculus as a foundation. In some points, this will be a bit of a review, but in biology, we tend to think about or ecological biology. You can also apply it to suborganismic or something below the organism biology, but they are much stronger in the ecological fields. And those four worldviews or four paradigms exist at the same time in our science and in our understanding of how we do science in biology. So the four competing worldviews, the four competing paradigms, right? We thought about some paradigms in physics at the beginning of the semester that was looking, for example, at the atom as the smallest unit of matter, which then was broken down into um, protons, neutrons, and electrons. And then that was broken down to bosons and quarks and void or black matter or other things that we don't exactly know what exists in those places. So we understand that there's other ways of thinking about matter that we didn't think before. And each of those views or concepts or categories or paradigms, they're essentially a core assumption, an idea that is not being tested in the questions that are asked by the scientists who believe in this paradigm. So, for example, if you believe in the diversity of life as your main paradigm for research, you will believe that pluralism of life forms is a stable ideal that nature aims toward. In other words, diversity is good. We want to have more species, more traits, and something that is simpler is less good. Go back to Aristotle, right? The idea that things become more godly, and then we moved on to Lamarck, who told us it's complexity. Well, what is complexity if not diversity of life, right? So this is kind of how this fits in. From there, we can move on to the systematic view, which essentially says that everything is the non-biotic world. It's all physics, right? Many people tell you always, a physicist thinks it says everything in the world is physics. That is essentially that view of biology. It says it's all the non-living things. It's the oxygen, it's the light, it's the energy, it's the flow of oxygen and carbon and nitrogen and phosphorus. That essentially dictates how the living things live, where they find them, and how they interact with each other. In terms of the history of life, we think about common design. We think about how species come from the same place, right? We've been now looking at this historical context, this genetic connection of all life forms, all of taxonomies based on this idea that all species come from common ancestors, and understanding how different they are from each other as explaining where you find them and why you find them where they are, which essentially has been the last few modules that we talked about in this class, right? How things are structured and how we find the commonalities between organisms, their analogies and homologies. And last, the fit of form and function basically takes the first couple of ideas that we talked about in this class of evolution as that basis. Everything becomes optimal based on evolutionary pressures. Okay, Darwinistic evolution becomes the basis for the questions you ask. And we don't even test it. We don't challenge that view. So understanding those becomes a step towards the environmental fields. And ecology connects the biology with other ideas or other fields. So from that, if you understand ecology, you might be able to take the biology and become an environmental scientist. Okay? My undergraduate degree was not in biology, but in environmental science. And as a consequence, the biology that I got was really from the ecology upwards. I did not get much of the other fields. We talked about ecology and economy, where things come together. Okay, that's the environmental fields, where essentially you take both ecological or biological concepts and you mix them with human ones and our needs, our existence as humans, and how they influence that. In this case, economy is ecos and nomia. So ecos again is our home, nomia is affairs, and in many times, the introduction to the environmental fields asks us, can we manage the affairs of the home we live in without understanding its laws or how it functions? So you'd start off with the ecology and then apply it to the humans and our processes and our needs later on. From there, we can move into conservation biology, which essentially applies biological laws and patterns to manage resources for the needs of ourselves, how we get to sustain our populations based on those laws of biology and ecology. And then we end up moving towards the ecological scales, understanding that I can study the interactions within nature and between nature, between organisms, and between organisms and the physical environment at different levels. So, first of all, what is a scale? It's a range of data, okay, a datum, many data, okay, that are different from each other along different points, okay, or spatial or temporal dimensions of a pattern or process. Okay, in this case, an ecological scale, sometimes called a geographic scale, has two main attributes, either grain or extent. And grain essentially, I have better definitions. The grain is the unit of measurement, what I'm actually measuring, and the extent is the range, the size of the impact, the limits of the area that I'm studying. So that becomes a really good way for us to think about what questions can I ask. My unit of measurement, a cell, an organism, a population, right? We talked about evolution was all about populations, a species, all populations of the same group of the same biological characteristics, or a community, many species living in the same space. It can even be an ecosystem, adding in the natural environment, or going all the way up to our planet or the universe. This is essentially the grain or my level of measurement. Am I looking at planets? Am I looking at an individual? Am I looking at a population? What am I looking at? And then on what level? Am I looking at a continent? Am I looking at a neighborhood? Am I looking at my region? Am I looking at the entire globe? What is the extent of my research? So again, the geographic scales can be from my yard to my neighborhood, my town, my country, my world, my home, my universe. Okay, remember my home, ecos being home. We can move it between those different dynamics and understand how they relate to each other. And as you move to a different geographic scale, you end up understanding things very, very differently. The pure ecological scale tends to look from the organism. Usually we start at the population because it's very hard to ask questions on a level or a sample size of one. And then we move on to a community, multiple species living in the same space, an ecosystem, which includes the physical environment, weather, climate, etc., or the biosphere, the entire Earth. We can think about some other scales, such as climatic scales, okay, in this case, biomes. And biomes brings together two different scales. The first of them is the average annual precipitation, how much rain does an environment get? Two, what's the average temperature year round? If it's very hot year round, then it's a desert and doesn't have much precipitation. If it's very cold but doesn't have much rain, then it's a tundra in the Arctic. If you have a lot of rain, it's tropical. Okay, and you can have tropical seasonal forests like where we live in New Orleans. It's something that is essentially subtropical, right? And we've got different environments that are dictated by two very specific things. Just the rain and the temperature. It tells us everything. If you go back to some of the world views, some of the different paradigms, that is very much the systematic view, the one that views the world through the lens of the non-biotic. Temperature, rain. That's non-biotic. That tells you what organisms live where. You can take the same geographic scales now, okay, and also apply them to latitudes or altitudes. They work the same, right? The same biomes change based on temperature, right, and precipitation. A mountain range or where you are on the planet will definitely change that scale as well. Again, I'm looking here at the increasing aridities, that's the rainfall along the x-axis here, and the temperature going colder as you move northwards along the globe, or southwards in the opposite direction. The same thing happens on a mountain. As you go upwards, the vegetation changes, and you end up in an Arctic situation up top, a tundra. In terms of biological grain, what we tend to study, many times we'll look at population sizes, okay, which is usually the number of individuals in a population. Sometimes population density, the number of individuals per unit area. And I'll give you some examples of how to use those. Okay, so if I'm looking at just the abundance in numbers, okay, we can see that, for example, we have 30,000 mountain lions estimated to live in the United States. You can look at the range, and that's the unit area. Where are they distributed? Is the density different, or is it the same? We can look at some shifts in abundance along ranges where people find them. Okay, for example, Burmese pythons, okay, in their native home range are much less dense in their populations than they are in their invasive range in Florida and all the way up into Louisiana, where we live right now. You can find Burmese pythons here once in a while. We can have a large extent, and large grain, looking at bigger patterns. For example, the Gulf Stream or the transatlantic currents that bring hot water, from the tropics to Europe and downwards, causing big shifts in temperature between Europe and the United States. Paris and Chicago are in the exact same um, longitude, longitude, no, latitude line. But the temperatures in Chicago are about 30 Fahrenheit colder than they are in Paris, simply because of this hot water being transported from the tropics upwards to the North Atlantic near Europe. So again, something of a bigger question. We also have a question, okay, if Greenland, okay, this is all driven by salinity of the ocean, if all the ice in Greenland would melt, how would that impact biodiversity in Europe? Okay, likely you will see a shift because temperatures would drop in Europe, similar to North America, and things will become very similar to each other. So that's kind of a way of thinking about how we apply some of those bigger questions of extent and grain communities. That is um, that is a mistake from something that's stayed from behind. Ignore that. And then we end up with regional scales. For example, desert systems, okay, people who study questions only in a specific type of environment, like the desert, are things that drive a lot of my own research and interest. So what, for example, questions I can ask are, what are some challenges of that specific environment? Okay, how difficult it is to live in such an environment. This is a photo I took myself of Nubian ibex in Sde Boker, Israel, where I used to live and did my master's and my PhD research. Beautiful type of mountain goat that lives in very arid environments and finds protection on cliffs. So things that will challenge their life is heat, water scarcity, food scarcity. For example, there's no place to hide from predation risk from predators, extreme cold at night because there's no vegetation to keep temperature on the land. It all evaporates and goes into the sky and outwards back to space. And we have huge differences in temperature between day and night. That's very difficult on organisms. We also have more sandy substrates and sand dunes that animals need to live in. So how do some organisms adapt to those types of things? Right? We can think about adaptations. They'll be active at night. They'll burrow underground. They'll have extreme kidney function or not need to drink. They'll have large feet that are also hairy so that they don't sink in the sand. They'll jump instead of walk. They'll live on cliffs to avoid predators. So all of these types of dynamics will change how I'm asking questions based on what organism I'm studying, if I'm studying a population, a community, and what are their needs and the environment in which they live. So some of the major scales that impact biological questions will be magnification, brain and extent, so starting from the molecular to the cellular to the tissue to the organism to the population, community, ecosystem, biome, or up to the entire globe. You can even add the universe in there. Okay, so how close am I looking? That essentially is the question of magnification. I could have a spatial scale, the size of the sample area that I'm looking. Am I looking at my neighborhood? Am I looking at the continent? Right? Which level am I looking at? Precipitation and temperature, right together, biomes, some geographics, local, regional, or transient. Am I looking at things that are in a very small area, regional dynamic, or am I looking at things that move through? That's quite important as well. We might look at geographic patterns of intercontinental or intracontinental, things that are looking comparing between different continents or environments, or something that is within the same space. Latitudinal and altitudinal, right? How far north I am or how high up I am in elevation from sea level. We might have genetic interpopulation dynamics like we studied in the microevolution, or intrapopulation, like we're looking, for example, at genetic gene flow, right, between populations. Is that something that I'm interested in? And let me leave it here for the class for Monday on populations.